We begin our bulletin from China, which says India must immediately cease all provocative actions at the border and thoroughly investigate the recent border clash. Speaking over the phone, Foreign Minister Wang Yi told his Indian counterpart that New Delhi should not misjudge Beijing's will to safeguard its territory. Wang said that Indian Army's Adventurous Act triggered the clash and demanded that New Delhi strictly control frontline troops and punish those responsible. He said India and China should step up communication through existing channels like special representatives mechanism on the Sino-India boundary. The Chinese Foreign Ministry said the two sides agreed to de-escalate the situation as soon as possible. The phone call took place 2 days after 20 Indian soldiers were killed in clashes with Chinese soldiers in the Galwan Valley region of eastern Ladakh. Well, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has expressed concern over reports of violence at the line of actual control between India and China. Guterres has urged both sides to exercise maximum restraint. Eric Kaneko, the associate spokesperson for the UN Secretary General, said there are positive reports that the two countries have engaged to de-escalate the situation. Meanwhile, Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi said Hindutva ideology is to be blamed for the current conflict. Qureshi said Beijing tried to resolve the border dispute, but Delhi continued construction in the disputed area. He said both China and Pakistan are opposed to India's illegal annexation of Kashmir in August last year. Meanwhile, Washington says it's closely monitoring the dispute. In a statement, the State Department said it supports the desire to de-escalate expressed by both India and China. Now, the Pakistan Army has reaffirmed its resolve to expose India's targeting of civilians in occupied Kashmir and its support for terrorist outfits. The understanding was reached at the Corps Commanders meeting chaired by Army Chief General Qamar Javed Bajwa in Rawalpindi. In a statement, the military's media wing said the forum was briefed on national and regional security situation. The military's top brass vowed to keep supporting the Afghan peace process. The forum also discussed Army support to the government against COVID-19 as well as the locust threat. Now, Pakistan has recorded its highest one-day deaths by the COVID-19 as 136 people lost their lives. The death toll has now risen to 2,975. The Health Ministry says more than 5,800 cases were reported in the last day. The number of total infections has now crossed 154,000. Officials said more than 58,000 patients have recovered so far, while there are over 93,000 active cases in the country. The ministry said Punjab province has reported more than 58,000 cases and Sindh has recorded more than 57,000. There are some 19,000 infections in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and more than 8,000 in Balochistan. The capital, Islamabad, has reported over 9,000 cases, while Gilgit-Baltistan and Azad Jammu and Kashmir have reported nearly 19,000 cases. Now, Brazil has registered a record 34,918 COVID-19 cases in 4,918 COVID-19 cases in a single day, while nearly 1,300 people died as the country's death toll crossed 45,000. While in the US, 840 people lost their lives in the past 24 hours as the toll surged to nearly 117,000. Meanwhile, the global COVID-19 death count has crossed 441,000 with more than 8.1 million infections. More in this report.
As COVID-19 cases soar, the US has now lost more lives to the new coronavirus than the American deaths toll in World War I. In China, Beijing has shut all schools and cancelled over 1,200 flights amid fears of a second wave.
The situation of the outbreak has become extremely severe. Therefore, under the guidance of the expert team from the National Health Commission, we have recently organized experts to assess the development of the outbreak. According to the leading group for COVID-19 prevention and control in Beijing, we, after applying for approval in line with procedure, decided to raise the emergency response in Beijing from the 3rd level to the 2nd level, starting from this moment on June 16th.
In Europe, most of the countries have begun to ease lockdown restrictions and establish travel corridors. The UK's Prime Minister Boris Johnson says London seeks unrestricted travel to Spain and France as soon as possible.
Just to say, obviously, I'll be talking to Emmanuel Macron about all sorts of ways in which we can bring our countries together, making sure that we eventually will be able to travel freely to and from each other's countries. Same goes obviously for Spain as soon as we can. The reason for having the quarantine system is very simple. We don't want to re-import the disease.
Meanwhile, New Zealand has deployed military to oversee the quarantine facilities and strengthen border checks after 2 new cases.
This case represents an unacceptable failure of the system. It should never have happened, and it cannot be repeated. From the beginning, we have taken an extraordinarily cautious approach at the border. That is why we have required every returning New Zealander to go into a facility that we manage.
Meanwhile, Mexico has reported almost 4,600 new infections along with 730 fatalities in past 24 hours. In Honduras, President Juan Orlando Hernandez has been diagnosed with the coronavirus.
Moving on, the European Commission has urged global leaders to cooperate to buy bulk quantities of potential COVID-19 vaccines. EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said cooperation is needed to avoid harmful competition and ensuring vaccines are available for poor countries. With around a dozen potential vaccines now in human trials, rich countries have been rushing to buy up doses in advance from the pharmaceutical companies. The Commission said it is worried that such competition could raise the prices of vaccines for everyone. The EU is planning to spend over $2 billion on the advance purchase of vaccines and testing on behalf of the 27 member states. The United States has so far made clear it is prioritizing its own citizens for COVID-19 vaccines. Now, Kabul says 12 members of the Afghan National Defense Forces have been killed in Taliban's attacks in the country's northern Jowzjan province. A spokesman for Jowzjan governor said 5 others were wounded in the attack on 2 security checkpoints in Akcha district. It said 5 Taliban fighters were also killed and 10 others wounded in the clashes. The spokesperson said the Taliban have also taken 4 security personnel captive. The Taliban have neither confirmed or denied the raids. The United States has imposed punishing new sanctions on Syria that aim to further weaken the government of President Bashar al-Assad. In a tweet, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said 39 designations will target the Damascus government, including Assad and his wife. Pompeo said more sanctions will come until the Assad regime stops the brutal war and agrees to a political solution. But there are fears that the sanctions will make the plight of ordinary Syrians even more desperate. Meanwhile, the uncle of Syrian president has been sentenced to 4 years in prison by a French court for laundering money. Rifat al-Assad was convicted of embezzling Syrian state funds to buy homes and offices worth £76 million. The court ruled his assets in Paris and London will be seized. Now, Turkey says it has launched Operation Claw Tiger against the Kurdish militants in northern Iraq. The Defense Ministry said Turkish forces are now in the Haftanine region to operate against the Kurdish Worker Party fighters and other terrorist groups. The ministry said the special forces, along with surveillance and attack drones, have entered the region for an air operation. It said the latest operation is being carried out as part of Turkey's legitimate defense rights as per the international laws. Operation Claw Tiger is a follow-up of Operation Claw Eagle that Turkey started on Monday. Ankara had claimed destroying 81 targets of the Kurdistan Workers' Party in that operation. Turkey holds the PKK responsible for the deaths of some 40,000 people in a 30-year terror campaign. Meanwhile, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says Ankara, Moscow and Tehran have agreed to hold a dialogue on the Syrian settlement. He said the presidents of the three countries will speak on video conference and later hold a summit in Tehran. Lavrov made the announcement following a meeting with his Iranian counterpart Javad Zarif. The Russian foreign minister said video conference may take place before a gathering of the Syrian Constitutional Committee. Lavrov said Russia's approach to the Syrian conflict can also be applied to Libya. He said Moscow is making efforts to convince the Libyan warring sides to start negotiations. Zarif said Tehran supports Russian and Turkish efforts in the country to end the conflict. More news coming up after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Now moving on with the news stories. Libyan Prime Minister Fayez al-Sarraj has urged the UN to provide technical assistance in documenting evidence of crimes committed by Khalifa Haftar. In a message to the UN Libya mission, al-Sarraj called for probing the crimes and violations committed in Tripoli and Tarhuna. Al-Sarraj said Haftar's militias should be investigated and held accountable. Libya's government of national accord has regained control of the capital Tripoli and Tarhuna from Haftar's forces. Now, Lebanon's Hezbollah has accused the U.S. of preventing dollars from reaching the crisis-hit country. In a televised address, the group's chief Hassan Nasrallah said dollar injections were needed to shore up Lebanon's pound currency. Nasrallah said the dollar shortage has worsened, resulting in record price hikes. On the ongoing IMF talks, Nasrallah said they could take months and up to a year.
Preventing the necessary amounts of US dollars from reaching Lebanon. We will say why later on. Secondly, the Americans are pressuring and intervening on the central bank to forbid them to inject the necessary amount of dollars in the markets.
Nasrallah also slammed Washington over its sanctions on Syria, saying the US aims to starve the country. Now moving on, the US has called on world powers to demand Iran to cooperate with the International Atomic Energy Agency. In a tweet, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said Iran's unprecedented obstruction is deeply concerning and unacceptable. Pompeo's remarks come after the Atomic Agency expressed concerns over Tehran's denial of giving access to its nuclear sites. The agency called on Iran to cooperate immediately with the forum. Meanwhile, U.S. envoy for Iran Brian Hook has called for an open-ended arms embargo on Tehran. He said Washington believes an extension of an arms embargo should be done indefinitely without a fixed date. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia has called on the international community to act against Israel to stop its aggressive behavior that threatens regional stability. In a statement, Media Minister Majid al-Kasabi said the cabinet reaffirmed kingdom's rejection of Israeli plans to annex Palestinian territories. The statement said the cabinet called for a unified Islamic position against Israel's blatant violation of international resolutions. The cabinet also slammed Yemen's Houthi rebels for firing ballistic missiles and using drones to target civilians in the country. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia-led coalition fighting in Yemen has asked the UN to provide details of the children killed in Yemen. Yesterday, the UN accused that the coalition was responsible of killing 222 children last year. The UAE says it can work with Israel on some areas while still having political differences with the state. Speaking at a virtual conference, Foreign Affairs State Minister Anwar Gargash said the two countries can work on tech and COVID-19 fight. Gargash said communication with Israel was important and will yield better results than other routes taken in the past. He said the UAE is against any annexation as being proposed by the Israeli government.
And we say we disagree with you on this. We don't think it's a good idea. But at the same time, there are areas such as COVID, technology, and other things that we can actually work together.
Well, Israel has no diplomatic relations with the Gulf Arab countries, but common concerns over Iran's regional influence have led to a limited thaw in the ties. Now moving on to North Korea, which has rejected South Korea's offer to send special envoys to ease escalating tensions and vowed to redeploy troops on border areas. North Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un's sister, Kim Yo-jong, said Pyongyang has flatly rejected the sinister proposal.
She also accused South Korea's President Moon Jae-in of being an American puppet and blamed him for failing the 2018 pacts. Meanwhile, South Korea's President Moon Jae-in has met with a group of former unification ministers to discuss the latest escalations with North Korea. Earlier, Seoul slammed the criticism directed at Moon, while the military has warned Pyongyang of stern response if it resorts to military action. In a statement, Seoul's Joint Chiefs of Staff said Pyongyang will pay the price if it impedes two-decade-long efforts for peace in the Korean peninsula. The statement came hours after Pyongyang said it will redeploy troops to Mount Kumgang and Kaesong near the border. Meanwhile, the US urged North Korea to refrain from taking further counterproductive actions after it blew up a liaison office over anti-Pyongyang leaflets.
In the US, the protesters have continued to demand police reforms and abolishment of monuments honoring racist, pro-slavery and colonial figures. A statue of Christopher Columbus in St. Louis has become the latest monument to be taken down in protest against killing of an unarmed black man, George Floyd. Meanwhile, US President Donald Trump has signed an executive order aimed at improving police practices, saying Americans demand law and order. In the US Capitol, senators debated a legislation that concentrates more on data collection than on policy changes with regards to the use of lethal force. Democratic senators branded Trump's executive order as insufficient, saying the measure fell short of holding rule-breaking police officers accountable. But Trump opposed widespread demand of defunding and replacing the police with community initiatives.
Part of this new credentialing process, chokeholds will be banned, except if an officer's life is at risk. And I will say we've dealt with all of the various departments, and everybody said, it's time. We have to do it. Additionally, we're looking at new advanced and powerful, less lethal weapons to help prevent deadly interactions. New devices are being developed all the time, and we're looking at the best of them. And cost is no object, no object. Under this executive order, departments will also need a share of information about credible abuses so that officers with significant issues do not simply move from one police department to the next.
Meanwhile, Minneapolis Police Chief Madaria Arradondo urged the public to let good officers do their jobs after some had reported threats and abuse. Now moving on, Venezuela Supreme Court has ousted the leaders of two key opposition parties just months ahead of legislative elections. The court said the democratic action would be led by longtime member Bernab Gutierrez, while Jose Brito will lead the First Justice Party. Brito was expelled from his party in December, while Gutierrez was ousted for conspiring with the administration of President Nicolas Maduro. The opposition legislators have criticized the move, fueling criticism that Maduro is tampering with elections after a crushing economic collapse. This latest development comes after the Supreme Court named a new electoral body in an unusual move that has been rejected by the opposition. Now moving on, some 15 giant tortoises who lived in captivity for decades were released into the wild of the Galapagos Islands. Their species has been rescued from the brink of extinction. More news in this report.
The Galapagos giant tortoise, which can live up to 200 years, was one of the species that helped Charles Darwin formulate his theory of evolution in the 19th century. UNESCO declared the islands where they live a World Heritage Site. In 1965, a captive breeding program was started on the island of Santa Cruz. Diego, a tortoise more than 100-year-old, is credited with helping to save his species from extinction.
This program was able to reproduce in captivity some 2,000 offspring, of which 800 came from Diego. Without a doubt, this is a successful program since we were able to restore this population that was almost at the brink of extinction with only 15 individuals.
Now the tortoises have returned to Hispaniola Island after spending time in quarantine, 80 years after being taken from their birth site.
Upon arrival on Hispaniola Island, the tortoises were taken 2.5 kilometers by the rangers, and once they arrived at their release site, the rangers and scientists observed the tortoises' initial behavior. It's worth noting that all the tortoises have a satellite tracking system which allows us to remotely monitor them during the adoption period, which will be approximately 6 months, after which time we'll return to Hispaniola to perform the first ecological monitoring to understand the tortoises' behavior on site.
The island is very dry, arid even, but to Diego, it's home.
Pakistan's legendary actor, anchor person and politician Tariq Aziz has died at the age of 84 after protracted illness in Lahore city. Aziz was the first male television announcer of Pakistan's history. He hosted the longest-running live quiz show in the country's history.
पाकिस्तान टेलीविजन सर्विस की जानिब से तारिक अजीज आपसे मुखातिब है।
Tariq Aziz was the first male television announcer of Pakistan's history. He hosted the longest-running live quiz show in the country's history by the name of Nilam Gar and later Tariq Aziz Show. The show was first aired on Pakistan television in 1974. Aziz also acted in films and dramas and also presented news for some time. The legendary artist also worked for Pakistan Broadcasting Corporation and was considered a maestro voiceover artist. Prime Minister Imran Khan, politicians, showbiz industry notables, and his massive fan base have mourned the death of the legendary artist. Aziz was also elected as a member of Pakistan's National Assembly in 1997. He was bestowed upon with Presidential Pride of Performance Award in 1992 for his invaluable services.
Business news coming up after a short break. The U.S. Commerce Department says American companies will work with Chinese technology company Huawei on setting standards for 5G networks. In a statement, Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross said the U.S. will not cede leadership in global innovation. He said this action recognizes the importance of harnessing American ingenuity to protect its economic and national security. Huawei has welcomed the decision, saying it will continue to hold sincere discussions with its counterparts. The Chinese telecom giant was put on a U.S. blacklist in May 2019, which restricts the firms from doing business with Huawei. IMF chief economist Geeta Gopinath says both advanced and emerging market economies will be in recession in 2020. The global economy is on track for a more significant contraction than the International Monetary Fund estimated back in April. In an interview, Gopinath said that the forthcoming World Economic Outlook update is likely to show negative growth rates. She said the global economy would suffer the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression of 1930s. The fund also said the current crisis is unlike anything the world has seen before. UK says its exports can increase by £1 billion through fresh trade deals with Australia and New Zealand. In a statement, Trade Minister Liz Truss laid out London's negotiating objectives before the start of formal talks. Truss said wide-range free trade agreements with Canberra and Wellington are a powerful way to make good on the promises of Brexit. Meanwhile, Australian Minister of Trade Simon Birmingham says Canberra is ready to help London find new beginnings post-Brexit. New Zealand's Trade Minister David Parker echoed Birmingham's sentiments. UK's objectives for each deal are broadly focused on increasing goods and services trade and cross-border investment. The first round of negotiations between Australia and the UK is expected to be held via video conference on June 29th. In the US, Pacific Gas and Electric has pleaded guilty on 84 counts of involuntary manslaughter in relations in a devastating 2018 wildfire. CEO Bill Johnson entered the plea during a hearing in Butte County Superior Court. In a statement, Johnson accepted responsibility for the fire on behalf of 23,000 employees. He said the Camp Fire, considered the most destructive wildfire in California history, changed the communities forever. The guilty plea is a part of an agreement with the prosecutors to end all criminal proceedings against the company. The Camp Fire destroyed about 18,000 buildings and wrecked much of the town of Paradise. Wall Street stocks have climbed following a big rally in the previous session, fueled by a growing belief that worse may be over for the U.S. economy. The shares of Amazon and Netflix rose more than 1%, while Apple also surged over 0.6%. The rise in Home Depot and Pfizer stocks lifted the Dow Jones Industrial Average Index. After early gains, the S&P 500 index traded at a fraction lower. Nasdaq Composite also traded higher. Meanwhile, oil prices dropped on fears over fresh outbreaks of COVID-19, but prices absorbed some support from stimulus measures. Now let's have a look at the weather update. With the weather update, we come to the end of this bulletin. For the latest updates, you can always follow us on social media as Indus.News. Take care.